Hi. Hi. We are from the Video Game History Foundation, and we're going to talk about saving video game history. It's a complex topic with a lot of facets. We're going to go over kind of what we do, what this field means, and we're going to talk a lot about a thing we did this week that you might have seen that we think is pretty important to the future of game preservation. Intros before we start. My name is Phil Salvador. I'm the library director at the Video Game History Foundation, so managing our collections of stuff, trying to turn it into a resource you'll be able to research pretty soon, hopefully.
And then I'm Frank Cifaldi. I'm the founder and the co-director of the Video Game History Foundation. I had been doing sort of amateur citizen video game preservation for decades before I started this thing, and then I spent several years making a gigantic mess of artifacts that Phil was hired to clean up. So I want to say off the bat that these panels, we really like these to be open. So like just kind of show of hands. Are there things that you guys want to talk about? Like do you think you might have questions, stuff like that at the end? A little bit. Okay. Right. Hopefully we'll bring up some questions because we tend to sort of like get through the panel quickly because it tends to raise a lot of questions. And I just want to encourage people that at the end of this, please get up to the mic because that's where the magic happens. So, all right, should we start? You want me to?
Yeah, go ahead. Just kind of intro what we do.
So yeah, we're a nonprofit dedicated to preserving the history of video games. And that means a lot of different things, which we'll get into. But essentially, you know, I identified years ago that there were some sort of what I thought were holes in the way that we were approaching how we remember the history of video games and how we provide access to material that like historians need to make documentaries, write books, stuff like that. So, why does video game preservation matter? Do I need to convince anyone in this room that we good? Anyone not like video games? Show of hands. Yeah, right on. But I think the more interesting question then is, what does that mean, right? Like we all inherently know preserving video games, that's important, but what does that mean actually? Does that mean that an organization like ours that operates a physical space, do we collect every video game ever made in the history of mankind? It does. Oh, I didn't know. Okay, I guess the panel's over. Someone confirmed that this is what video game preservation means. We could go that route. You know, we could have an office that looks like this, and we could spend all of our donor money on Burning Rangers or whatever. But we have to be able to play them too, right? So, okay, I guess we'll maintain every piece of hardware ever made, right? So this about covers it, except for, you know, the thousands of unique arcade PCBs that are required to play the history of coin-op games. And that's just physical stuff. We should probably collect every digital game ever made, right? You know, everything on Steam, all of the eShop stuff. I guess we did kind of technically collect that. But this slide deck's a little outdated. Don't forget cell phone games, right? Like every game ever made for iOS. Like it's our job if we're preserving video games to preserve every video game, right? We feel that if you're collecting video games, let me backtrack a little bit. So we're in service to the historian, okay? So we exist to make sure that video game history is being told correctly, that people have access to the things that give them the insight they need to actually tell stories. And when it comes to like a retail video game, there's some of that you can extrapolate if you're a historian. Like if you're holding a game in your hand and you're playing it, it's like, okay, you know what it looked like, you know what it sounded like, you know how it feels to play. If we've spent the thousands of extra on eBay, we have the packaging, right? So like you know how the game was packaged and sold to people. You know how the manual might have you know, not only told people how to play, but like expressed creatively things outside of the game. But that's kind of it, right? You don't really know like how it was sold to people. You don't know what players at the time like thought about it, right? You don't know who made it. You might have the credit screen, but you don't really know anything about those people. You don't know why it was made. You don't know like, you know, its social impact, things like that. You just have like this game in a vacuum. I often when we talk about this, I often talk about Citizen Kane. Show of hands, what's a Citizen Kane of video games? This is the most interesting question, right? But I make that comparison because the first time I watched, anyone seen Citizen Kane? Just, okay, good. So you watch Citizen Kane just on its own, pretty entertaining movie, right? You know, like Wells and his crew, they're like radio and theater actors, and you know, the movie is surprisingly kind of funny because you kind of think it's like the stuffy thing, and it's a really good movie on its own. But if you actually understand the context of why it was made and who William Randolph Hearst was and what a friggin' jerk that guy was, and understand how it was like this really hilarious takedown of this rich asshole, right? Like that movie, just you watch it again and it has just all this other meaning, and it's really hard to get that from just watching the movie, and we feel that it's the same thing with video games. So point is, you know, someone who is studying the history of games needs more than just the games. So here at the Video Game History Foundation, we kind of separate those into two categories, right? In terms of like what objects that we collect need to explain to people, and those two categories, we like to say they either can extrapolate how games were made or how they were played. So in terms of how they were made, this is the kind of stuff that we collect. And I actually didn't say this before, but just I think it's kind of interesting. We literally do not collect retail video games at the Video Game History Foundation. We just don't think there's a lot of utility for it versus you know, how much it costs to store that stuff, not let alone buy it, right? Like we just don't think that historians, okay, let me put this another way. Historians know where the ROMs are, right? Like they know how to find the ROMs. They don't need me to give them a cartridge. What they need is context. They need understanding. So in terms of how games were made, we collect things like the actual raw material that game developers made when they were making the game, as opposed to like the final finished product. So like their source code, their original art, their tools, their documentation. We collect, you know, unfinished builds of games. We collect games that never shipped at all, right? They were made but never manufactured. We don't collect the people who made them, but we do collect their stories. Just some quick photo examples here, and this is stuff that has had utility. So anyone know Danny O'Dwyer? He does No Clip. It's a series of documentaries, got a couple nods. So he was doing a documentary on DMA Design, which is the company that became Rockstar, and they made Grand Theft Auto. And he wanted to really get into like, okay, Grand Theft Auto, like the first one, where did it come from? Who made it? We don't really have a lot of insight into that. And he asked us to dig into his into our archives for his documentary. And that upper left photo, like, I don't think it was ever published anywhere, but that's a photo of the people who made Grand Theft Auto 1. That's the entire team, right? And it takes a collection like ours to like be able to find stuff like that. We were able to find that because we collect what are called press kits, right? So if you were running a video game magazine, you would get stuff in the mail from game publishers that help you with your coverage. In this case, it was a press kit for Grand Theft Auto that had things like, well, actually the lower right is concept art from Grand Theft Auto 1, right? So it had like concept art and some screenshots of tools and this photo of the team. And this is something that was sent to every magazine, but no one knew what Grand Theft Auto was yet. You know what I mean? It was like a game it was just another game being made. So none of this stuff ever got published, and we're just lucky that we found a press kit that wasn't thrown away. So like this is the kind of stuff that we're able to provide to people telling history. Am I talking too much? Do you want to take the next slide?
Yeah, sure. Well, the other half of it is also understanding like the context of how the games were played, because there's an example I love, which was, think about like the original Sonic the Hedgehog, for instance. Even if you have the development material and you have the game itself, what you're missing is the piece of like, well, you know, playing it at the time, this was an unusually fast game. This was a new way of playing a platformer, and that was part of the experience, was like how people received it. So we try to capture that in the way that we know, the best way we can. I think this is something that there's kind of no end to how you could represent this stuff. For us, what we do, a big part of it is we collect video game magazines, because just like pound for pound, if you're trying to figure out like what people thought about games at that time and reviews, like that's the best way to do it. Like that is, all those magazines, tons of reviews and criticism and fan letters, and that just gives you a sense of what was important to people, what people liked, what genres were growing and whatnot. But we can expand that even further to things like live streams of games, videos for live games that don't exist anymore. Like we can have videos of play sessions to understand how they were played. This is a Splatoon themed event. It's like even if we save the game itself, that's not going to capture the wars that happen in Splatoon. Like we need to some documentation of that. We have that picture on the right of that weird near hoax somebody made of the hidden door, which. That's also part of the story of that game. Whether or not Yoko Taro wants that, that's part of the story of this game now is kind of the fan community interaction with it. How games were marketed, all the really cringy ads from the 90s, which we should get a picture of one of those in there because those are terrible.
Yeah.
A lot of that stuff. Again, like press releases you mentioned. There was, what was that? Was it like the Dreamcast promo where it was like a dunk tank or something? Like what was? There was some event from the night, or is that our Donkey Kong?
Oh, are you thinking of the? Okay, we have material from a press event that isn't very well documented for the first Banjo-Kazooie game.
That's what it was, yeah.
And they had kids diving in a pool of honey to retrieve copies of the game or something.
It sounds really unsanitary. Just like
But yeah, just to extrapolate on this a little bit too, like when we say how games were played. I think of that as shorthand for how games fit into society in their time, right? So it's not just like player impressions. It's also like how the games were sold to people, like what the companies wanted you to think and things like that.
We have the example of that, the press release for Earthbound trying to explain that game. So, Earthbound, I think we all kind of know at this point, it was a misunderstood game at the time, and now it has this big cult movement behind it, that it's been a very influential video game. And I think there's a lot of kind of post-mortem activity of well, why didn't this game do well? And we, on the one hand, we have the reviews explaining that, it was because it was like this cartoony, pixely game at the time when 3D was becoming big. But we also have Nintendo's press release they sent out for Earthbound, which is they have no idea how to market this game.
They do not.
What did they say it was like?
Let's see. The game contains obscure language. I don't know what that means. And it teaches family values like that you should call home and talk to your mom sometimes. That's how they're trying to sell this to the press, right? And the gaming press at the time, it's mid-95. Anyone who's reviewing games has now imported a PlayStation from Japan and is playing these brand new 3D games. I don't even Tomba or whatever, Tobal number, I don't know, whatever the launch games were. They're in 3D world. They're looking forward to the future. And Nintendo's here's a throwback RPG. It's reminds us of the 8-bit days. And everyone's we don't like this cartoony garbage anymore. So almost every review of Earthbound, when it came out, if you lay them on a table, and I did this actually with documentarians who were looking at Earthbound. It's oh, no one wanted this game in '95. That's why it failed. There's no way you can market this game to Americans in '95. That's just not the time for it.
So these are the kind of things, these resources are, this is what's hard for people to get in a lot of cases. We have this thing we like to say that people are pretty bad game historians, but it's not really their fault.
Right.
There's just not a lot of access to primary source material for understanding the history of video games beyond just them as objects.
Here's some mainstream bad history.
I still can't believe that Tetris question actually made it on Jeopardy.
There was a really obvious Photoshop meme where someone photoshopped the manual for Tetris on the NES and said that all the blocks had names like Orange Ricky, Hero, and Smash Boy. And it was just a thing that went around on Twitter, and it literally made it on Jeopardy, on broadcast Jeopardy, as a fact.
It's that's how quickly the historical record gets muddy, because you Google Tetris piece name, and that's the first thing that comes up now, because Google is terrible now. That's just how quickly this stuff gets lost.
The high literature experiment, Ready Player One, was claimed that the very first video game Easter egg was in Adventure on the 2600, which is absolutely untrue, but it made it into the Spielberg movie as well as the book.
We're going to be undoing Ernest Cline's damage on that forever, I think, at this point.
Gunpei Yokoi, accomplished engineer, joined Nintendo not as a janitor, which many people say, which is just horrifying to his legacy. And then, actually, these last two we'll get to later, but there's this historical perception that E.T. on the 2600 was the worst game ever and destroyed the entire video game industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, it's not so much that people are bad game historians. It's just that the tools suck. Like, it's really hard to find primary source material.
So let's do one example. We picked a magazine as an example of, like, if you want to learn about the context of the game industry. We picked Video Gaming, Computer Gaming Illustrated, I think was the name of it. Yes. So
the only magazine that ever had an op-ed written by MAGWest about how video games are art. I swear to God.
It's great. And he's like, I can be Batman professionally, but when you play games, you can be a hero too. It's like this very inspirational message.
But he's also very clear. He's like, no, that stuff's not for me. I'm not a nerd, but I get it if you are.
I think that same issue had an op-ed from Roy Rogers, who was like, I don't get this. Oh no, it was the guy who played the Lone Ranger, I think. It was like some Western actor who was like, oh, they're cool, I guess.
MAGWest is also like, I don't need to be Batman in a video game because I am Batman, but anyway, Video Gaming, Computer Gaming Illustrated. How do we go research this, Phil?
So you can go to this wonderful place called WorldCat, which is this, a lot of library collections are plugged in here, and you can search for, a single work, and it will show you all the libraries where it's available. And there are 2 libraries in here right now that
in the country,
in the entire United States, that have issues of Video Gaming Illustrated.
And by the way, the one that isn't the library, the one that isn't the Strong Museum of Play has 2 random issues out of their full 2-year run. So that is the state of that.
If you want to go all the way to Michigan and read one magazine, you can do that. The good news is there are groups that are scanning these things. They're getting them up online on the Internet Archive. This is the full run, I believe, of Video Gaming Illustrated. So those are up there if you want to access those PDFs.
That's missing a couple. It's just a screenshot.
Okay, well...
There's more than that, Phil. Come on.
Okay, but either way, for now, yeah, they're up there for now.
Yes.
This, I think we're all very familiar now with how the internet is impermanent, right? Like, people can put things up, but there's takedown requests, websites go down, search engines break, all this stuff happens. One example of that is a magazine that's, I think, really important for early video game and arcade history, specifically called Replay Magazine. Which is still running. It's is it fair to say like it's an amusement magazine basically?
It is a coin-op magazine. It's about the coin-op industry. Well, actually, Replay specifically is coin-op entertainment, as opposed to its competitor Playmeter, which is all things coin-op. So one issue might be a cover story on like Street Fighter 2, and the next one is like the cigarette issue. I swear, I'm not making that up.
It's very weird magazines. But point being, those ones, this magazine is still running, and the folks who run it, understandably, are protective of their material. So
they actually sell back issues on the website as well, so they have a legitimate reason to be like, don't read this stuff for free.
So when someone uploads these to the internet, they get taken down, and they get taken down again, and they get taken down again and again. But luckily, we have libraries where you can read these things. Oh, it's this like the same. Like, it's just 2 places again. It's the Strong Museum again. Oh my God, we love the Strong so much. In Rochester, New York, if you want to take the 7-hour train ride from New York City to get there, and the Library of Congress, who again don't have the whole run of this magazine. They have like a couple.
They have, just some very, very random, disparate issues of Replay at the Library of Congress, and that's it. Those are your options for researching the coin-op entertainment industry in the U.S. through contemporary materials. So I'm going to take over. So what are we doing about it? Actually, this is probably more you, so I'm going to take that back. I'm not taking over.
Okay, so you got a good slide. So we talked about how, we've been building this material, and now we're building an archive. And that's one of the things we are putting a lot of energy into this year, is we are building a digital archive of our materials. It's physical and digital, I should say. There's a picture in the upper left of a part of our book and magazine collection, which we're, getting all this stuff on shelves, completing, complete sets of things, and scanning additional issues as we get them in. As we get duplicates in that we can, like chop and put through a scanner. And we've done a lot so far. We've scanned like, 1,200 additional issues of magazines so far?
I mean, we did a tally of every video game related magazine that was scanned somewhere on the internet, even if it was kind of hard to find. And we cross-referenced that with all of our duplicate issues and tried to like diff and figure out like what's still unscanned. And we have so far scanned 1,200 new to the internet magazines and sent them off to magazine preservation groups. Thank you, Keith. I think that's actually a really good accomplishment too. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're doing that. We're also finding pathways to get some of these materials online in a shareable way people can access that's also secure and responsible. Thinking about developer materials, we got a very exciting donation from a longtime game industry producer who's out in Chicago who just kept a ton of stuff over the years. And a lot of it is like, behind the scenes documentation and memos. But he also gave us a CD with like his entire Microsoft Outlook backup. And it's like, oh, we can't just put this online. Like we can't just dump all this guy's emails or, like financial things. Like here's the social security number of everyone who worked on like Slugfest or whatever. It's like, oh, we can't just put that on the internet. So we're finding a pathway to do that, to make this stuff accessible to researchers in a way that we can show, like, we can get this stuff out there in a responsible way, share it with researchers who need it, and it's not going to destroy everything.
Yeah.
So for some specific examples of stuff we've been collecting recently, these are just two fun ones that have come up this year so far. You can talk about the Sonic one, I think.
Oh, sure. So the upper left, this is kind of interesting. So Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on the Genesis. I think most people just assume it was made in Japan, like the first one. It was not. It was actually made here in the Bay Area. And the core Japanese level designer and programmer were actually, like, they moved here to work on the project, but a lot of the other team, including most of the artists, were Americans hired at Sega's San Francisco studio. And one of those artists, Tom Payne, we worked with to dig out the paper that, like, when he left Sega, he just kind of packed up his desk, and he had some cool paperwork related to making Sonic 2, which, I mean, that was a really influential game to me. It's like holy documents, right? And he happened to, so the way artists on Sonic 2 worked was they were assigned levels. Like, this is your level. You're doing Metropolis Zone or whatever. Tom had two. One of them was, well, the random example, I just said Metropolis Zone. But the other one was Cyber City Zone, which is a level that never made it into the game at all. But he actually had the hand-drawn maps by Yasuhara, the level designer, of what Cyber City was supposed to be, including all the hazards and stuff. So we've been trying to sort of basically reconstruct the level. This is an example, just a little slice of like a lost world from Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which, again, just kind of gives you insight into how the game was made. I think there's a lot to say about that because that was a really troubled project that, like, that game seems huge in retrospect, but about half of it was actually cut because of their production time was cut short. So really cool stuff there. And then this other project is your baby.
Yeah, this has been exciting. We've been working with the folks who made Myst to back up their video archives, which is super exciting. Obviously, the Myst series, hugely influential adventure games. And a lot of content was live action. They filmed things on like blue screens and grease screens. And I think they realized as they were getting into, after the first game came out, they were like, oh, this is going to be a big deal, so we should film, a lot of behind-the-scenes content to help. If we're doing a documentary about these games, for instance. So a lot of that was not used. So we have, I think it's going to be over like 100 hours of video, and it's like interviews with everybody who worked on the game, behind the scenes while they were making it. It's all this incredible content. And they owned their own property in like Washington State, and they have just kept all their tapes in a basement for a long time. There was finally, and this goes to the point of like who we're trying to serve, a documentarian who was making a documentary about Myst and has been talking with Cyan and was like, yeah, we have these, these tapes in our basement. We don't really know what's on them. And we were like, we can do this. Like, this is something we can get involved with. So
I think the plan was just like pop them in and watch them. But it's like, let's just digitize all of them.
Yeah, like while the iron's hot, we have these things out. Like, let's do it. So we're keeping a copy for our library that they've given us permission to share. And we're giving a copy back to them to work with. They're doing a remake of Riven right now, so who knows what they're going to do with that stuff. And then we're also giving it to the documentarian to use. So it's really, I think it's great to show that we can work with these things in a trustworthy way and get them to people who need to use them.
I think it's a really good example of how an organization like ours can work directly with the video game industry in a way that makes sense for everybody. Because, I mean, it's not controversial that video game history is important. Like, everyone knows that. Like, everyone.
It's like pizza is good. It's like a very easy thing you can agree to.
Yeah, we get it. But also, like, businesses are businesses, and taking the time to do historical preservation costs money, and money is not infinite. And so this is a situation where it's like we came to Cyan and we're like, look, how about, we do this thing that works for everyone. We'll take on the burden and the cost of digitizing all your material so that you can do whatever you want with it. And all we're asking for in exchange is that the public can access this video that we're digitizing. And they were like, yeah, that's great. That works for us. You're not cutting into our bottom line by sharing our history and getting our fans excited, So it works out for everyone.
There's actually still a Myst convention happening, and I went there last month to show this off. It brought the house down. It was awesome. Go to the Mysterium convention if you're a Myst fan. It's great. It's a great time. But in addition to this, we're also doing some public education stuff, and you can speak briefly to some of the things we do.
Sure. Just a few examples here. We do some pop-up museum exhibits at shows, not at this one, but this example is from Portland Retro Gaming Expo. We did an exhibit last year on the history of Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man, and I actually. I did not know that some of the creators of Miss Pac-Man were attending the show, and we got a little seal of approval here from Kevin Curran, who ran General Computer, because much like Sonic 2, not made in Japan, Miss Pac-Man was made in the US. A lot of people don't know that one either. The Secret of Monkey Island, anyone know this game? Okay, good. This is one of my favorite games ever. And we had access to the original source code and the source material that made this game. And we had access to Ron Gilbert, who was the lead creator, because I just know him. And so we actually did this virtual event where we were able to show people how the game was made by actually going into its scripting language and showing people how Monkey Island was scripted in a way where people understood it. Which, when we're sort of like interpreting history and helping you understand the significance of a game like Monkey Island, being able to, several of you in this game in this room played this game. You know that the humor's a little strange and a little improv feeling, right? Like lines just kind of like come at you and it doesn't feel like there's. This is going to sound negative, but it doesn't feel like there was a lot of preemptive thought. It was just like a joke comes at you, and we were able to demonstrate that's because of the scripting language that Ron built for this game. Made it really easy to put a joke in the game, hit build, see how it looked in the game, and then just forget it was ever in there. And we demonstrated that by literally I just went in and added a new joke line to one of the scenes in the game, and then we built it in 5 minutes and showed it running, and it's just, it helps you understand where that game came from, why it's the way it is, which we really like. And then the last example, we do a podcast called the Video Game History Hour, where we interpret and teach history by typically by working with external people who just put out an article, who just put out a video. We kind of get them in the studio, Zoom call, and get them to sort of explain their process and what fascinated them about their subject and what it took for them to sort of dig up this history. So we're not just, we're not just collecting information for others to use. We're kind of showing other people how to use the material is how I tend to think of this.
So we like to say that, kind of jokingly, the two activities we do is we're trying to stop the bleeding and fix the future. So on the one hand, we're meeting with folks. We're talking with those developers who have things in their basement. We're talking with folks like Cyan, and we're going to offices when companies close down. We're collecting things. We're finding people on LinkedIn and hitting them up, which is slightly weird, but it works really well.
I bought a recruiter tool on LinkedIn so that I could stalk people. It works really well.
And we're building an archive, which again, hopefully we'll have more to share about in this coming year. But the other part of it is we're trying to fix the future. We're trying to make it easier to share this stuff, to make it clear that we can share these things in a responsible manner. We can make history accessible. It's not going to harm the game industry. And part of that is fixing outdated copyright law. And this brings us to the second portion of this panel. We're going to talk about something we did this week that you might have seen. For the last year, we've been working on a study that proves that 87% of classic video games are out of print.
I'm just curious, what was the reach of this? Did anyone happen to see headlines about this over the past week? Oh, that's so awesome. Most of you, yes.
That's great. I wrote that report. So we've been working on this for a while. This has been a big undertaking. And it's funny we just said all this stuff about oh, we're not worrying so much about the physical games. You can, people know where the ROMs are. But that's not a long-term solution. There are institutions building game collections, and that's great. But right now, you have to go visit them in person and sit down and play the game on a piece of hardware. So you need, increasingly expensive games. You need someone who can maintain the hardware. It's getting cumbersome, and there's.
Let's be clear. That's the legal path.
That's what exists right now.
Yeah,
the legal way to get access to these things. So I can imagine a scenario in even a few decades where a lot of these games are not available to purchase. They're not in print in any meaningful form anymore. So we've been saying it's not just that they're out of print, it's that they're critically endangered. These games are only going to exist in sort of a locked down museum setting at some point in the mid-future.
Right. It's kind of almost even going back to what we were talking about with Replay Magazine, right? It's like, you can find the ROMs for now. Like, I personally don't trust that the internet that we know is going to be the internet that we know in 10 years. I think it's being commoditized, and it's going to be really, really difficult to locate the dark web,
Yeah, so we did this study, and it got coverage. Various sites have been talking about this. It's an alarming statistic, and I think people get shocked by that number. It's comparable, we found, to somewhere between the survival rate of American silent films and the commercial availability of pre-World War II music, which is not good. That's like when Calvin Coolidge was president, and we're talking about games from 30 years ago.
Right.
We should not be comparing these things.
And also, just by the way, the video game industry outperforms all those other industries by far revenue-wise, and yet 87% of its history is out of print.
Yeah, so this is kind of loose for the rest of this panel, but we just want to talk about this. Our brain has been in this mode all week. Kind of our brains are fried right now from talking about this.
How many NPR interviews did you do this year? 3. This week?
This week. Yeah, it's a lot. So why did we do this study specifically? So we've talked about methods of getting access to games and how right now there's this very kind of fixed pathway to do it. There is a pathway, for libraries and archives to be able to share things remotely and securely. So essentially doing basically in-browser emulation in an archival regulated way where, you have to be a researcher and sign a form and get access to a game that way. So there is a process through which libraries, archives, other groups can petition to get exemptions to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to make some of this work easier. And last time there was a cycle, back in 2021, a bunch of groups we work with came forward and brought this proposal forward. And it was approved for non-game software.
Yeah.
So if you know what the difference between a game and a software is, please tell us, because the Copyright Office didn't.
They will not define this for us, yeah.
No, so it's very kind of vague and unclear. But the reason they made that distinction is because the video game industry came to these hearings and said, this is going to impact our bottom line. This is going to eat into our sales. We have this healthy market of getting classic games back out there. We have Nintendo Switch Online, and there's all these other, you can get a PlayStation Classic. And those things are true, but we also kind of know inherently, you can't get most games.
Yeah.
I don't think the camera's recording the audience, but show of hands, who here has had to pirate a game that's not available in any form anymore? Right, okay.
Oh, I think literally everyone, yeah.
So we've all kind of known this, but it's been anecdotes, right? It's been, we say, hey, you can't get most games, and the industry says, yeah, but you can get, Mario World. And we've just been kind of having this circular
We have an old. An old is over here. That's all the old you need is this one old.
But it's been a very, circular conversation. So it was okay, let's put a number behind it. If we want to have this, a productive conversation about what we need, what kind of game preservation needs we have and whether those conflict with what exists in the commercial world, let's get some numbers down there.
And I want to pause real quick on something just to sort of restate something that you said to make it, just to hammer it home a little bit. When we're talking about the ability for a library or an archive to provide remote access to material, there are exemptions for the written word. There's exemptions for recorded audio, right?
Well, I'll say more specifically, there's specific parts of copyright law that prohibit doing a lot of normal preservation type activities if the thing you're working with has any kind of digital rights management, essentially.
Right.
That's the barrier. And that is, most video games, even with a lockout chip on a cartridge, that's anti-tampering technology, anti-copying technology. So things that you could do, scanning pages of a book and sharing a PDF with someone, we don't really have a pathway to do that with games, because even if that's legal fair use activity, it's still technically illegal to do that with the game because there's copy protection involved. Which, that's why the Copyright Office lets people bring these petitions forward and say hey, we need to work around this portion of it. But now we have this weird situation where we can remotely share a copy of Excel with you, like an old Microsoft Excel build.
Oh,
from the 90s.
but wait, there's a hidden game in Excel. Is it a game?
That's a good question. I don't know. Windows comes with solitaire. Does that make Windows?
Oh, Windows is a game. Yeah.
Damn. I think it's software if you're not having fun. I think is the definition. But we needed some numbers behind it, so we got those numbers, and they're like, does that go forward? There we go.
There you go.
It's yikes on bikes. It's not good. It's so yeah, our numbers looking across all historical video games, which we defined as pre-2010, which that's just kind of an arbitrary cutoff. It was, that's kind of when digital distribution started to really catch on with Xbox Live Arcade and all that. So this seemed like a good year for, let's look at things that came prior to that regime of game distribution and just look at, that stuff that's been released physically generally, that's the shareware era, that kind of era of video games. And it's bad numbers. As you can see there, we kind of broke it down into 5-year periods, and none of those broke 20% availability, which that's pretty bad. Even I expected it to be higher during like 2006 to 2009 because that's what, like the early era of Steam and GOG starting, but no, it's just as bad as everything that came before.
Well, like, am I right? Nothing hit 20%, right? Like,
Yeah,
no 5-year era has 20% representation.
And it's kind of funny. You can see on the graph, you can see the trends where it's like things get more distributed when we get into like the NES era and Super Nintendo, and there's a bit of a dive when we get into like N64, which is harder to emulate.
Right, that's exactly it. It gets harder to emulate those systems. Yeah.
But the one that's really concerning for our purposes is if you look at this, look at 1980 to 1984 and everything that came before it. Of every game we looked at that came out before the NES era, less than 3% are still in print, which that sucks. That is a terrible number. And it's because they're not commercially viable. Like, no one wants to buy a Commodore 64 game. Like, that's not sexy. It's not Mario World.
Right.
It's
and,
not.
Yeah, and again, it's like this is just available through any official means at all. Like, this isn't even necessarily like for sale, right? This is just like, I can access this without risking breaking the law.
Yeah, it's
right?
the copyright holder has a pathway for you to get this game. Is what we're looking at. And for all those games, for the most part, you can't. Which is, if we want to understand the history of games, that's troubling. And again, so why this matters? Again, like we're not naive about the fact that like, yeah, people can go to like coolromsite.ru and get copies of these things. Like, that exists for now, but again, we're thinking about the long-term future on this. And
don't go to whatever that site is.
It's probably worse than
Reddit are ROMs.
For as long as that exists, too.
Exactly,
Yeah,
that's the
as the
point.
internet's falling apart.
Yeah.
So it's a case where it's like, no, we want to think about what is the legal pathway for this. Like, even in academic research, people are relying on these like abandonware websites to get video games. And I think the way we're trying to frame this is we need to stop expecting the commercial industry is going to carry the burden of game preservation, because it's not their job. They're companies. Their job is to sell you PlayStation 5s and sell you a remake of Persona 3, but not the original Persona 3. And I know some people were upset about that. And to demonstrate growth to shareholders. And like, if history fits into that, it's great, and they can sell their resell bestseller games and kind of their highlight franchises. But I think about it in the context of like what's happening with like Warner Brothers and HBO Max and all that stuff, where it's like titles are being delisted because they're not seen as commercially valuable. Turner Classic Movies is facing this kind of existential crisis because it's a great thing to have until you decide you need to start showing dramatic growth, and then you start chopping the things that are less massively profitable than, I don't know, the Flash movie, I guess they decided, which was not a huge hit. But that's where they're prioritizing things. And I guess the point is that that's kind of what we're thinking with this as well. It's like the game industry, they're a business, their goal is not to preserve history. Whose goal is to preserve history is libraries and archives. And we need more tools in our toolkit to get this work done. And like our institution specifically, we don't collect a lot of the retail games because people are doing that. Other museums are doing it. Private collectors are doing it. And then in some cases, donating their collections to museums. But then
or even loaning them to us when we need them. That is something that exists in this ecosystem, right? It's like we know where to find the stuff.
Yeah, and we just need to think about how can we make this stuff accessible in a way that's going to be equitable and easily available to people who need to research it.
And exist in 50 years.
And exist in 50 years, yeah. Like, if we say critically endangered because, you know, if the only copy of a game is going to be a private collector or a museum, it's like, how are people going to get to that? You know, is it going to be the equivalent of a Rhino where you walk by and say, there's Rule of Rose, great, and then keep going? And like, how do we...
The equivalent of a rhino?
The last rhinoceros. There's like very few of them. There's like one in a zoo, and it's like, look, there's a rhino. Guess they're dying out, and like that's kind of where that species is right now. So we have the ability to make this stuff accessible. We just need to work on the legal permissions. And I think part of it is also we need the industry, I wouldn't even say to get on board with this, but just to understand that it's like, this is like, you're doing a good job with the best sellers. We're not worried about a world where you can't get Final Fantasy. We're worried about a world where you can't get this like weird art game for the Amiga. Like that's the stuff we're concerned about. And now we have a number on that, and that is 87% is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So to bring it back more broadly to the foundation, though, I mean, you can speak to kind of all these institutions, how they fit together.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's like, you know, when we're saying that we shouldn't rely on emulation and piracy, we're not saying that that doesn't have a function. And I'm not even saying that isn't like literally the best way to do this. I think it is. Like, I think mass piracy is the safest way to preserve video game history. We just think there should be other avenues because I don't know what the future holds. And so we feel like we're just part of a larger ecosystem when it comes to what video game preservation means. We need the industry on board, like you said, to, you know, kind of allow us to do our jobs, right? We need researchers to help us understand like what it is that it's important to preserve, right? Like academics, similar collectors are there to, I mean, preservation to me with video games kind of started in the collector world. Like that's where we even knew which games existed because they had to catalog them in order to figure out what the catalog was. You know, the creators of these games, like this is all part of a larger ecosystem that, go ahead.
And even going back to what you said about the industry and like letting us do our jobs, I would say it's even helping the industry understand that this isn't going to harm them.
Right.
Like with the case of Cyan, like we can share your collections and this is going to benefit everyone. This is going to be exciting for the community. It's going to be useful for you. Similar with these long out of print games that, you know, fall outside the purview of, you know, what you know, Nintendo was trying to sell us this week. It's like we can share these things and celebrate and broaden access to game history in a way that's not going to impact your bottom line, that benefits everybody. And we want more folks on board with this. This isn't like, we're not trying to like, you know, defeat the industry or something. It's like we want everyone on board with this mission because we think we can do this in a way that's right, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the unique sells of the Video Game History Foundation in general and versus other institutions is that we have industry experience. I was a game developer for a long time. I was an editor for a business publication for the video game industry for a long time. Like, you know, I kind of come from an industry background, not a library and archives background.
I come from a library archives background. So
you were hired to fill my holes. Yeah. Oh God, that sounded awful.
Thanks for coming to the panel, everybody.
But you know, in terms of like, we're kind of uniquely positioned to show the industry, like, no, it's okay, honey. You know, like we're not hurting you. You know, so that the Mist thing's a great example. That Monkey Island stream that I did was another great example because like, I think if you asked the Walt Disney Corporation, can we have the source code to The Secret of Monkey Island because we want to show people, they'll be like, oh no, my trade secrets. But you know, we were able to show like, no, like in the hands of an historian and like we can be really respectful. Like this is just only celebrating your past. No one's looking at your source code being like, oh, look at that function, you idiot. Like, no. Like it's all beneficial to be able to discuss these things in an appropriate way. And like I said, we think video game preservation is an ecosystem. We think everyone has a role. We don't think any institution can do everything. I certainly don't want us to even attempt to do everything. We're just kind of chipping away at the things that we have an impact on.
Yeah,
but
one of our colleagues, John Paul Dyson at the Strong Museum of Play, had a really good comparison where he said it's like to do this kind of thing, it's having an aircraft carrier versus having like a small boat, where it's like there are bigger groups that can do some of this mass scale working with the industry stuff. There are also these smaller people who can go out and like work with private collectors or contact individual developers. And we all kind of have different roles in this ecosystem. Not that it's like a war, we're not like blowing things up, but it's different abilities and capabilities and interest areas and the ability to target different parts. Like we all kind of fit together in this.
Yeah, I don't know that we would have a Cyan tape project if you weren't a Cyan nerd. You know,
yeah,
and like
I don't think we have the Monkey Island project if you
weren't a Monkey Island nerd. Yeah, exactly. It's like everyone should be like working to their strengths and figuring out how can I contribute to this greater whole that is video game preservation within my means and my interests.
Yeah, or even just one specific example, like we talked about community documentation. People will ask us sometimes like, oh, can you document like the history of Doom mods? And my answer is like, one, like probably not, like that seems really beyond us, but also like there are people doing that. You can go to Doom Wiki and they have this amazing extensive documentation of all these historical WADs and their developers and the Doom community. And it's like, I'd rather support what they're doing rather than being like, we have to be the central organization to do all this stuff. Like we can all kind of do this as a distributed network.
And I think that's it. I think that's it. So thank you so much, everyone. Get in touch with us if you'd like. Take a photo if you need to reference this later. Let's line up to this microphone for, well, actually, no, you know what? I'm not going to make you get up. We can hear each other. This room's small. So, yeah, gray shirt.
Sorry.
That's all right.
So the whole thing about the experience, the whole idea of how the game is played.
Yeah.
I imagine that there's stuff like long plays on EU, a bunch of gameplay videos that go through the whole experience. But I'm wondering more about like, you know, those videos that show a bunch of specific cutscenes that might happen. For example, videos like Just One Gamer. I don't know if the channel's around, because sometimes cutscenes happen under a set of unique scenarios.
Yeah.
Let's say, for example, Fire Emblem Awakening for the Nintendo 3DS. There's a specific cutscene that you have to set up between two characters, Chrom and Olivia. But the only way to unlock those characters is to take one specific level and basically go out of your way to do a bunch of weird stuff in order to unlock those specific cutscenes, which is a little bit of a weird little gameplay variation that you would have to do. So I find it more like this.
I get what you're saying. So like getting like, the question eventually is like beyond just like recording people playing the game, like video documentation of all the permutations of things and how games can be played in those variations and whatnot. And
or even documenting like regional differences between like the PAL version and the US version as this other feature. Or
every possible combination of Mass Effect characters getting it all together, like those various things. Yeah, like absolutely. So I think about, there's a scholar who I really like in the UK named James Newman, who has this really provocative sort of thesis. I think that one of the chapter titles in his book is called Let Video Games Die. And his argument is that that stuff is actually more valuable than having the game itself. That like having evidence of this is this person's experience and they chose these players and this is what came out of it is part of that too. In terms of like the super thorough, like documenting every permutation of something, I don't like, I think that might be, that's a community thing. Like,
that is a community thing. That is not the role of an archive, I think.
Yeah, I think that might be like too far for a museum to back up all that video.
I think the role of an archive is, if possible, to allow people to document those things, right? But documenting those things is a little bit outside the scope of the kind of work that, of where we fit in here. Like that is more of a player as part of the ecosystem, we feel.
But okay, so it's their part, so the UK would then do their part as long as it's still available for the people that still research.
Fair, yeah. And I think there's a very valid argument that an archive like ours should be collecting video, right, of these moments in games, and I think that's extremely fair and is possibly the purview of an archive.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
As somebody who works in publishing, what are like, I have two questions. As somebody who works in publishing, what are like some tangible ways that we should advocate for like preservation and this kind of stuff within companies and organizations?
Okay, so the question was, as someone who works in publishing, how can someone who works in publishing advocate for preservation in the ways that we're talking about?
To be clear, do you mean like game publishing or like press? Okay, game publishing. Okay.
So, one way is, like, it kind of depends on if you're going full hard mode, right? Or if you're looking for easy stuff, right? Like, the easiest stuff off the top is just like, is there ephemeral stuff that gets created as part of the publishing process, right? Like, are there flyers that are made for trade shows? Are there print proofs of packaging, and like maybe even like early drafts of things from the publishing process that might be worthy of study someday that usually are going to toss, right? Like, so getting that stuff to an archive like ours. I mean, something that comes to mind for me is we worked with IDOS when they were still here. They're all in the UK now because that's where Square Enix kind of located them. But you know, they invited us to come over and just kind of grab everything because their lease was out and they had to throw everything away. And like, you know, we were able to grab some boxes of marketing material and things like that. But there was this one cubicle that had a bunch of their digital assets on like zip disk, right? Like I remember I opened the box and the top disc said Pandemonium logo. I don't know if anyone remembers Pandemonium. It was a PS1 game by IDOS. It was like Pandemonium logo PSD. And I was like, oh, we should take this stuff. This is really important and you're gonna throw it away. And you know, the person I was working with was like, well, you know, we can't let you take stuff like that because we don't know what other data is on here. And like, I don't know how to adapt that to you, but just keep in mind, like, those are the challenges that we face sometimes is like, oh, this work hasn't been vetted because it costs money and resources to vet work before we donate it to you. And I think the short answer to that is just kind of be an internal advocate and start that yourself. Another thing that comes to mind, publisher-wise, is Electronic Arts. Electronic Arts has an archive team. And that's not because someone at the top decided we should have an archive team. It's because someone in the trenches who was just there a long time just started it kind of without asking anybody, and it just kind of grew from there. So I think that sort of internal advocacy, just starting there and just being the voice in the room that's like, don't throw that away, you know, and like, hey, we should work with these. I think that starts a snowball effect that a lot of publishers aren't, because like publishers don't have this stuff in mind. So I think it really is just being that internal advocate and seeing where that goes is maybe the strongest thing to do.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I don't want to say that publishers traditionally have like a fear of archives or anything, but
No.
I think there is like, there's the assumption either it's, you know, people just putting things up on like a Google Drive and you lose control of your intellectual property, or even if it's an internal thing, it's like, you know, it's this trade secret stuff no one can have access to, and it has to be like archived on a data tape and put in a vault no one can ever access, even if the employees need it. Like,
And
I
then
think,
thrown away as soon as you move offices. That's how it goes.
yeah, I've heard a story about a local game company that kept this extensive backup of stuff, and then when they moved offices, they just tossed it.
Oh, you've only heard one of those. That's cute.
Yeah, there's a lot of that happening. But point being, that's the kind of thing where there can be, even if it's not like donating things to archives, there is that kind of internal advocacy of like, hey, we should be keeping better care of this stuff. This will be useful for us and for others in the future.
Yeah, even if it's literally like, no, don't throw this box away, I'll take care of it. You know what I mean? Like there could be stuff like that.
Be the box guy.
Be the box guy. Yeah, let's go with you.
Hi, yes. With the emphasis on digital preservation of physical media, I'm curious if there's any efforts right now to preserve the hardware and peripherals, specifically internal component schematics, as well as actual quality 3D model CAD of the physical items.
Okay, so the question was, are there efforts to preserve the physical hardware objects such as consoles and peripherals, right? In terms of like the schematics and the physical form of them and things like that. It seemed like you had an answer. I want to do mine first, which is that on our part, not really. We will do that for things that no one else can access. So for example, we fully documented and emulated, this is one of the craziest things we ever did, the unreleased Sega VR helmet for the Sega Genesis. Like we were able to sort of poke and prod at source code for one of its games to figure out how the helmet worked, even though we didn't have one, because no one has one. And we were able to virtualize that accessory that no one has. So we'll do that if it's stuff that like no one else can get their hands on. If it is on eBay sometimes, right? Like we don't bother personally here because we feel like that's more of a community effort. Like a community could do that. That said, while we haven't come across this yet, things like actual printed schematics, you know, if people held on to those and we can have them donated to us, that is the kind of thing that we would very enthusiastically go after for our collection so that people can better understand and virtualize the hardware and increase compatibility in their FPGA re-implementations or whatever.
Yeah, I think specifically thinking of the Sega VR example, that was one where we said we did that, but like the development of making it work was done by Rich Whitehouse, who's a member of our team who like has extensive experience developing emulators, and that came from. We based this on source code we got from someone in the community who just was interested in reaching out to people. So it's another one of those cases where it was, the community doing a lot of this work, and we were able to build on it and do something with it. So in a lot of these cases, like, yeah, we don't have like the schematics of the Dreamcast or something, but it's a case where like, if that's the kind of thing people compiled, I think there's room for it in an archive.
Yeah.
We just, again, individually don't have the capacity to do a lot of this. So it's, I think, finding places where it makes sense to complement the community's efforts on that.
And I think this hasn't really been discussed, but there is some notion here of elevating communal efforts, right? So we've done a little bit of funding for like we've purchased equipment and hosting for like retromags.com, which hosts a lot of retro video game magazines. We've contributed money toward buying like artifacts that need to be digitized. We've sort of like been able to contribute a little bit from our funding. We're not quite at the level that I want to be, where we can actually like offer grants to people for things like hardware preservation, but it is sort of a long-term vision of ours I called it the Video Game History Foundation on purpose. Like we want to be that sort of foundation that can provide resources to the community. We're just not there yet because I didn't do the traditional thing where you start an archive with like funding. I just kind of started it and figured out funding later. So like we're not quite there yet.
So to answer your specific question, we are not. There are weirdos who are, and we love them. We want to give them money.
Yeah, that's a great way of summing that up. Yeah. Other questions?
Thank you.
Yes.
How do you guys view like bootlegs, homebrew, shovelware, those kind of games?
Oh, I want to answer this.
Really considered official games.
Yeah, how do you guys view bootlegs, homebrew, you said shovelware also, like within the history of games? Oh my God, I love that stuff. So I'll give you an example because in addition to archiving, we also interpret history, right? And so I gave an example earlier of a Miss Pac-Man exhibit that we did. In 2018, we did an exhibit on the 35th anniversary of the Famicom, the NES. And I took that opportunity to sort of reinterpret that traditional narrative of the NES because that system, its official support ends in '95. But if you take a worldwide view and you ignore specific US copyright laws and you understand how other countries work, it actually turns out there has not been a year without a commercial NES game yet. Like, it's like starting in '83, there's been commercial NES work every year because after the official support ends here, it's like, well, go to China, go to Russia, go to Brazil. There's a lot of clones of this system because there's no, like Sony is not distributing the PlayStation in Russia. You know what I mean? Like there's not like new consoles yet. And like the NES is still the current console in some places. And so new software was written. A lot of it was like, like versions of Disney games that are really janky. And I don't know if you've ever seen like you're asking about bootleg games, but there's a lot of weird NES stuff. Like there's some really strange Lion King games where Simba like literally hangs himself if you get a game over. It's really weird. But the point is that like I'm with you. I think that's a part of the story that we don't often tell. And this is an example where like I was really excited to be like, no, history's not just this ethnocentric U.S. version of what this system was. Like the soul of this system, means different things around the world, and that broader historical context tells you that these quote unquote bootleg games, they're bootleg to us. They're real games over in China and Russia and places like that because that was their console industry, and so we're big proponents of that. We were just I'm gonna bring up Mast. Sorry. We in our archive of magazines, we have this really strange magazine called it's called Interactive Quarterly, which is just this total nondescript name, Interactive Quarterly. It is a magazine from the mid-90s about pornographic video game CD-ROMs, which is not a thing that any video game archive like cares about, but to us, like that's part of the history too. And I bring that up because, again, Phil's a big Myst fan. We found an ad for a porn parody game called Mast that is like not documented on the internet at all, and we can't find a copy.
We talked to Cyan, they didn't know about it. They want us to find a copy now.
we gotta preserve Mast. Yeah. So point is, yes, like that really speaks to our core mission, I think, is like we want history to be told correctly. You know, like we want a more broad view. We want primary source material so that people understand it. And we want to like change these traditional narratives. And honestly, for me, a lot of it's just personal frustration reading the traditional video game history books. It's like, these are the histories of white guys in suits making business deals. That's not the video game industry. You know, like they're real people like made things. This is an art form, and I want to tell that story correctly, and that's kind of where we're coming from.
My short answer to that question is that in a previous life, I was the administrator for the biggest Mario fan game website, and I have a backup of that website, and we're trying to figure out what to do with that. Not the foundation, but just like us, the people who work for the site. It's like, okay, this is history, but we don't really know what to do with this just yet. This is massively copyright infringing, but we'll figure this out later. We're basically done, but I think we have time for one more quick question. Rainbow Mask, I saw you had a question. Yes?
Yeah, so I have a question kind of in regards to like the non-game software DMCA vagueness. Like, what kind of challenges or sort of gaps of knowledge do you find when interfacing with institutions or policymakers about video game preservation?
That's a good question. To answer it really quick, it was about when we're working with policymakers and institutions, what kind of gaps of knowledge do we face with video games, like that game software divide we're facing. I think generally, there's still just within the world of video games, this need to continue justifying itself, that I think it's still, in some quarters, not totally taken seriously as a cultural medium, and it's treated as entertainment and toys still, even within people who preserve that stuff. It's just kind of like, it's a bonus. It's like, oh, and there's games as well. I think that's mainly what I've noticed, is that whenever we work with institutions, it often needs to be justified over and over. Previously, when I worked at a university in the DC area, we ran into this issue of, every single time it's like, why video games? We have a game design program. Why build a game library? And I think it's repeating that over and over to the right audiences. I think this conversation is getting easier as time goes on, but especially as we deal with things like the Copyright Office. It's still a hard conversation to kind of explain the lay of the land, which is like why we got these numbers. Like everyone kind of knows that like most games are abandonware, but like how do we express that in a formal, studious way to a group like that? That's been kind of the issue. Yeah,
I also think that just to trail off that a little bit, that I think that most people don't think about this stuff very hard because they don't have to. Whereas we do, like it's literally our jobs. And I think that if you ask most people, if you were to talk to most people, even within the industry, about how our past is disappearing, there might be this perception, it's like, well, they're all on eBay, right? Like you can just get all the games on eBay. It's
for
not a big
now.
deal. Well,
going back to the
For now, and also, when Nintendo shut down the eShop, they dragged away 1,000 games that were never on physical media. So like, times are changing, Grandpa.
Well, that's where we're going to end that one. Thank you all so much for coming. This was great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.